Chapter 1. The Summer Garden Party. The sun hung lazily in the late afternoon sky, casting its golden glow across the picturesque village of Little Skelton. The houses, all tidy cottages with flower-lined paths, exuded an almost idyllic charm. The local tea shop, nestled by the green, was already preparing for its daily wave of customers, and the scent of freshly baked scones mingled with the crisp air. The soft buzz of conversation, interspersed with laughter, filled the village, creating a sense of untroubled normalcy. It was the kind of day where nothing seemed capable of disturbing the peace. At the heart of this quiet scene was the garden party at the home of Mrs. Eleanor Langley. The widow of a distinguished local barrister, Mrs. Langley had become known for her elegant affairs, drawing people from all walks of life. Her sprawling estate, tucked at the edge of the village, was a vision of sophistication. White lace tables were adorned with delicate china cups, and a bouquet of roses sat in the center, their scent mingling with the faint aroma of lemon cake and pastries. Every guest in attendance had donned their finest attire, giving the gathering an air of restrained opulence. Miss Jane Marple, though, stood apart. At first glance, she could have been mistaken for just another elderly lady enjoying an afternoon out. Her simple gray dress, her soft cardigan, and her modest hat were typical of her, but her presence was far from ordinary. With her ever-observant eyes, Miss Marple had spent many years studying human nature, and today was no exception. She had come to the party not for the cakes or tea, but for the people. She quietly surveyed the crowd, her sharp mind taking in every subtle shift in behavior. The way a young man nervously fiddled with his tie. The woman who kept glancing at her watch, a habit that betrayed her impatience. The small smirk that appeared on Mr. Creighton's face as he spoke to his wife, a hint of something that Miss Marple couldn't yet place. But it wasn't the guests that Miss Marple was most interested in. It was the hostess herself. Eleanor Langley, standing at the edge of the garden, gracefully conversed with her guests, her warm laugh filling the air. Her elegant appearance, her immaculately styled hair and fine pearls, belied the tension in her eyes. Something was amiss, though Miss Marple could not yet pinpoint what. There was a restlessness about her, a nervous energy that didn't belong in such an event. It was when the first footman came to refill the wine glasses that Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted. She allowed herself a soft sigh, thankful for a moment to simply observe. But that peace was short-lived. A shrill scream cut through the air. It came from the far end of the garden, near the decorative flower bed. A wave of confusion rippled through the party, and Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the faintest flicker of alarm on Mrs. Langley's face. The hostess had turned swiftly at the sound, her face draining of color. For a moment, Miss Marple watched as Mrs. Langley froze, as if struck by some invisible force. Then, as if snapped out of her trance, she rushed toward the source of the sound. Guests followed in a disjointed rush, some confused, others more concerned for their own safety. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched the scene unfold. It didn't take long before a group of people gathered around Lily Langley, Mrs. Langley's niece, who had collapsed at the base of the flower bed. The young woman, pale and motionless, lay sprawled on the grass, her hand still clutching a small white envelope. At the sight of Lily's unconscious form, the murmurs grew louder. Eleanor Langley was the first to reach her, kneeling at her niece's side with frantic hands. "Lily!" Eleanor gasped, shaking the girl gently. "Lily, are you all right?" Miss Marple watched the scene unfold without moving. Her gaze never left Lily's limp figure. There was a stillness in the air now, a strange tension that neither the shocked guests nor the frantic hostess seemed to understand. Miss Marple stood slowly, her movements measured and deliberate, and made her way toward the group gathered around Lily. "I'm afraid it looks as though she's fainted, Eleanor," a woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "Perhaps she's overheated." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes sweeping over the group. She could see the concern, yes, but she also saw something else, a sense of relief. The kind that always accompanied a moment of chaos. It was subtle, but it was there, in the way some of the guests avoided looking directly at Lily or Eleanor. She noted their expressions carefully. None of them seemed truly alarmed by the situation. But why? As Miss Marple approached the unconscious woman, she observed the slight movement of Lily's hand. The girl's fingers were curled tightly around something that Miss Marple immediately recognized. A matchbox. Miss Marple reached down and gently pried it from the young woman's fingers. The matchbox was old, worn with age, and smelled faintly of burnt matches. She held it in her palm, considering it carefully. The sight of such an inconspicuous item struck her immediately as important, too important to have been overlooked by the others. "Eleanor, may I?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but insistent. Mrs. Langley hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting between her niece and Miss Marple, but eventually nodded. Miss Marple carefully slid the envelope from Lily's clenched hand, opening it with precise care. The paper inside was folded roughly, as though it had been hastily shoved into the envelope. The handwriting was scrawled in a hurried fashion, barely legible, but Miss Marple could make out the words, "Meet me at midnight. Or else." She held the note out to Mrs. Langley, who stared at it in stunned silence. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but probing. Mrs. Langley shook her head, her expression a mixture of disbelief and concern. No, I don't." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Lily's motionless form, then back to the crowd of onlookers who had gathered around them. The guests were all talking in low voices, offering their theories, but none of them were paying attention to the small but vital detail Miss Marple had already noticed. The matchbox. "There's something here that doesn't quite fit," Miss Marple said aloud, as if to herself. "Is she dead?" someone whispered from the edge of the crowd. The question echoed in the heavy silence, but Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on the matchbox. "Not yet," she said softly, though her words carried a certain weight. She knew something was wrong, something far deeper than just a fainting spell or simple heatstroke. The guests were still in a state of confusion when Dr. Weston, the village physician, arrived. He was a solid man, with thick glasses perched precariously on his nose. He immediately knelt by Lily's side, feeling her pulse and checking her breathing with professional detachment. "Just fainted, I suspect," Dr. Weston said after a few moments, his voice reassuring the others. "But we'll have to get her inside and let her rest. No need to panic." Miss Marple, however, wasn't convinced. She could see the slight tremble in Lily's hand as the girl's fingers began to twitch, her pulse steady but far too weak. Lily was not just fainting. Something was off, and Miss Marple was certain that this was no mere accident. As the doctor instructed the servants to take Lily inside, Miss Marple remained behind, her thoughts racing. The others were returning to their conversations, offering polite excuses to leave, no doubt eager to avoid being too involved. But Miss Marple's mind was already working through the puzzle. The note, the matchbox, the strange reaction of the guests, all of it pointed to something darker, something that would not be solved with simple explanations. She slowly made her way to the flower bed, crouching near the base where Lily had fallen. There, hidden in the petals, was something that would prove to be far more significant than anyone had realized, a small, tarnished coin. The coin had been tucked carefully beneath the flowers, as though it had been deliberately placed there. As Miss Marple picked it up, she could feel the weight of it in her palm, the faint imprint of a design that she recognized. It was old, much older than any of the villagers had realized. And with that, the first clue had been uncovered. It was only a matter of time before the rest would fall into place. Chapter 2. The village reacts. The following morning in Little Skelton was as calm and serene as any other, the early rays of the sun filtering through the trees and casting long shadows across the cobbled streets. However, beneath the quiet facade of everyday life, the events of the previous afternoon had left an undeniable ripple across the village. The garden party at Eleanor Langley's had been abruptly overshadowed by the unexpected collapse of her niece, Lily. Despite Dr. Weston's assurances that it was merely a fainting spell, something about the whole incident didn't sit right with Miss Marple. She had observed too much to believe the explanation at face value, and now, as the morning unfolded, she couldn't shake the feeling that the village was on the verge of unraveling something far darker than a simple medical emergency. The quiet hum of gossip had already begun to sweep through Little Skelton by the time Miss Marple set out for her morning walk. It was a crisp, clear day, and she had no particular destination in mind, only to gather more of the details that would inevitably present themselves. She passed by the bakery where Mrs. Hall, the widow who ran the shop, stood outside, her hands dusted with flour as she greeted a neighbor. Mrs. Hall had a tendency to overhear nearly everything, and Miss Marple's sharp ears caught snippets of the conversation. "I heard Lily Langley was found behind the flower bed, clutching some strange note," Mrs. Hall said, shaking her head. "People say it looked like she'd been poisoned or something." "It was just a fainting spell, surely," a man added, his voice tight. "Dr. Weston said so." "Oh, but I heard differently," Mrs. Hall countered, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There's been a lot of talk. You know, Mrs. Langley's housekeeper swears she saw someone sneaking around the back garden earlier that morning. She thought it was one of the servants, but the timing didn't add up. People are saying there's more to this than we're being told." Miss Marple paused, pretending to adjust her shawl, though her mind was already racing. Mrs. Hall's version of events was already being colored by whispers of conspiracy and suspicion. Miss Marple was familiar with the way such rumors could take root in a small village like Little Skelton, where secrets, however deeply buried, had a way of coming to light when least expected. She moved on, her thoughts turning toward Eleanor Langley. The widow had been terribly shaken the day before, and Miss Marple had not forgotten the subtle unease she had noticed in the hostess's demeanor. Eleanor had been too calm, too composed when the situation first unfolded. And that, in itself, was enough to warrant Miss Marple's suspicion. Her walk led her to the outskirts of the village, where the small church stood, its stone walls weathered by years of time and tide. The church was always a place of quiet reflection, and Miss Marple had learned over the years that it was also an ideal spot to observe the villagers' behavior. As she made her way to the churchyard, she saw that a small group had gathered outside, the men in quiet conversation while the women stood in tight circles, exchanging the latest gossip. Miss Marple's ears pricked up when she heard her name mentioned in the conversation. "You know, Miss Marple was there yesterday," Mrs. Grafton, the widow who lived next door to Miss Langley, was saying. "She was there when Lily collapsed. You think she knows something we don't?" "I'm sure she does," came the reply, from Mr. Potter, the village blacksmith. "She always does, doesn't she?" "Yes, but she's far too polite to say anything outright," Mrs. Grafton added with a knowing smile. "I'm sure she's been keeping quiet for a reason." Miss Marple, taking care to keep her distance, observed the group for a moment. It was clear that the villagers were already speculating, each offering their own theory based on little more than snippets of overheard conversation. It was the way of things in Little Skelton, a close-knit village where every neighbor seemed to know everyone else's business. But Miss Marple knew that in these early days, the rumors were just the beginning. The next step in the investigation would be to speak with Lily herself, though Miss Marple knew she would have to be patient. The young woman had been moved to her aunt's house for rest, but Miss Marple suspected that there was something more to Lily's collapse than the simple explanation of a fainting spell. As she walked slowly back to her cottage, she couldn't help but wonder who stood to gain from the strange events at the garden party. And more importantly, who would go to such lengths to make sure that Lily Langley was at the center of it all. By midday, the village was alive with the hum of normalcy once more. Mrs. Langley's tea shop was busier than ever, and even the children were back to playing in the streets, their voices ringing with laughter. However, the undercurrent of unease was still there, just beneath the surface. Miss Marple had already decided on her next course of action. She would visit Lily, but first, she needed to gather a bit more information. When she arrived at the Langley estate, she was greeted by Mrs. Langley herself, who looked far more composed than Miss Marple had expected. The previous day's turmoil seemed to have faded into the background, replaced by the woman's usual air of aloof dignity. But Miss Marple was not fooled. She had seen the cracks in the surface, the subtle signs of distress, and she knew there was more to Mrs. Langley's story than she was letting on. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Eleanor Langley said, her voice polite but strained. "I trust you're well?" "Quite well, thank you," Miss Marple replied, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of unease. "I've come to check on Lily. I do hope she's feeling better?" Mrs. Langley's eyes flickered for a moment, before she forced a smile. "She's resting, as Dr. Weston recommended. She was quite overwhelmed yesterday, poor dear. I've made sure she's as comfortable as possible." "I'm sure she's in good hands," Miss Marple said softly, though her mind was already working. "Perhaps you could tell me, Mrs. Langley, what exactly happened yesterday? You must have been quite shocked when Lily collapsed like that." Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening around the hem of her dress. I don't know, Miss Marple. It all happened so quickly. One moment, Lily was standing by the fountain, and the next, well, she just fell. There was nothing I could do." "But the note," Miss Marple interjected, her voice calm. "The one she was holding in her hand. Do you recognize it? Was it a message from someone?" At this, Mrs. Langley's expression faltered for the briefest of moments. "I don't know," she said quickly, too quickly. "I've never seen it before." "I see," Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. She didn't push the matter further, knowing that the answer would likely come in time. Instead, she took a step closer, lowering her voice. "And Lily's reaction, was it normal? She didn't seem like herself yesterday." Eleanor's eyes clouded, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw a flicker of something like doubt. "Lily is a sensitive girl," she said quietly. "She's always been a little delicate. I suppose it's not too surprising, given the stress she's been under." "Stress?" Miss Marple asked, raising an eyebrow. "What kind of stress, if you don't mind me asking?" But before Mrs. Langley could respond, a servant appeared in the doorway. "Miss Langley is awake, madam," the girl said quietly. "She's asking for Miss Marple." At last, Miss Marple thought. She would finally have the chance to speak with Lily. And perhaps, just perhaps, the answer she sought would soon come into focus. Lily Langley was lying in a plush armchair by the window, looking pale but far more alert than Miss Marple had expected. Her dark eyes met Miss Marple's gaze with a mixture of wariness and curiosity, but there was something in her expression that didn't quite match the gentle, demure young woman Miss Marple had seen at the party. "Good afternoon, Miss Langley," Miss Marple said, stepping closer to the chair. "I trust you're feeling better?" Lily gave a small, forced smile. "Yes, thank you. I'm afraid I've been quite a bother, haven't I?" "Not at all," Miss Marple replied gently, her eyes studying the young woman's face. "But I must admit, I am curious about the note you were holding when you collapsed. Do you remember anything about it?" Lily hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the envelope that still rested on the side table. Miss Marple noticed the way her fingers trembled slightly as she reached out to pick it up. I don't remember much," Lily said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It all happened so quickly. But the note? I don't know who it was from." "Do you recognize the handwriting?" Miss Marple pressed, her gaze unwavering. Lily shook her head slowly. "No. It's strange, though. I have a feeling I should know who wrote it, but I just can't remember." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I'm sure the answer will come in time," she said quietly, "and I'll be here to help you when it does." As Miss Marple turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that Lily was hiding something. Whether it was fear or guilt, Miss Marple couldn't yet tell, but one thing was certain: the mystery was far from over. And with each passing day, it was only going to grow deeper. Chapter 3, First suspects. The weather in Little Skelton had turned decidedly autumnal by the time Miss Marple made her way back to the Langley estate. The soft amber light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets, and the crisp air, filled with the scent of fallen leaves, hinted at a change in the season. Though the village was quieter now, the murmur of gossip that had swept through the garden party still lingered in the background. And for Miss Marple, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align in a way that suggested the worst was yet to come. The last few days had not been idle. Lily Langley, while still somewhat disoriented, had given Miss Marple a few more clues, though not nearly enough to form a coherent picture. There was something Lily wasn't telling her. The hesitation in her voice when she spoke about the note, the flicker of recognition she displayed when asked about its handwriting, all pointed to a deeper secret. But what was it? And why hadn't Lily been more forthcoming? That morning, Miss Marple had spent hours revisiting the scene of the garden party. She had walked the ground slowly, taking in every detail, every oddity. The flower bed behind which Lily had collapsed had been carefully tended, the flowers vibrant and colorful, but nothing stood out as unusual. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away, and certainly no trace of anyone who might have planted the ominous note. Still, Miss Marple knew from experience that the absence of evidence could sometimes be the most telling clue of all. The housekeeper, Mrs. Timmins, had been kind enough to show Miss Marple the room where Lily had been resting, and while Lily had made some progress, her guarded nature made it difficult to engage in any meaningful conversation. There were moments when Miss Marple could see the young woman's eyes darting to the door, as though anticipating someone's arrival, or perhaps fearing someone would find her alone. But every time Miss Marple pressed her for details, Lily's responses were careful, almost rehearsed. As Miss Marple sat in her cozy cottage later that evening, sipping her tea, the weight of the mystery continued to hang over her like an unseen storm. It wasn't just the collapsed young woman or the cryptic note that bothered her. It was the sense that something had been set in motion, a chain of events that could lead to far more than a simple misunderstanding. There was more at play in Little Skelton than anyone was willing to admit, and Miss Marple was determined to untangle it, no matter how long it took. The next day, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to the local constable, Richard Brooks. He was a well-meaning man, but his methods were conventional, to say the least. Brooks had already launched a cursory investigation into the incident at the Langley estate, but his inquiries had led to little more than dead ends. Lily's fainting spell had been chalked up to stress, and the note had been dismissed as a mere prank. "I trust you're doing well, Miss Marple," Constable Brooks said as he met her outside the station. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a somewhat awkward gait, but his polite demeanor put people at ease. He wore his uniform with a sense of duty, though Miss Marple could tell he was more concerned with the appearance of the investigation than with its substance. "I'm getting by, thank you," Miss Marple replied, her sharp eyes taking in the constable's posture. He was standing too rigidly, as though anticipating a difficult conversation. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've been thinking more about the incident at Mrs. Langley's estate, and about the note that Lily was holding when she collapsed." "Ah yes, the note," Brooks said, his tone slightly defensive. "It's been dismissed by most of the villagers as a childish prank. I spoke with Mrs. Timmins, the housekeeper, and she confirmed there's no history of threats or animosity within the family. You're familiar with these things, Miss Marple. It's easy to assume the worst, but I think we should leave it to the professionals." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Ah, but surely, Constable, there's something in the air, isn't there? A simple fainting spell wouldn't have led to the level of hysteria we saw." Something doesn't quite fit." Brooks shifted uncomfortably, clearly not thrilled to be questioned. "What do you suggest we do, Miss Marple? We've already spoken with everyone involved. Mrs. Langley insists nothing is amiss, and Lily is in no state to be of much help. And yet, I suspect there's more to this than just a fainting spell," Miss Marple said quietly. "Have you spoken to any of the other guests at the party? Any of the people who might have seen or heard something unusual?" "I did speak to a few of the guests," Brooks said slowly, "but nothing stands out. They're all quite convinced it was a case of exhaustion or heatstroke, perhaps brought on by stress. I don't know what else to tell you." Miss Marple thought for a moment before replying. "The guests might have missed something, Constable. Sometimes it's not the big things that matter, it's the small, inconspicuous details that tell the story. I suggest you focus on the people who might have had a vested interest in this incident." Brooks looked at her blankly, but Miss Marple could see his mind working behind his heavy brow. He wasn't accustomed to dealing with anything but the most straightforward cases, and her cryptic suggestions were unsettling to him. "I'll see what I can do," Brooks said reluctantly, though there was a hint of doubt in his voice. "But we can't make any assumptions without facts, Miss Marple. We need evidence." Miss Marple gave him a small nod, her eyes softening. "Of course, Constable. But remember, sometimes the facts aren't as clear as we'd like them to be." As Miss Marple walked back to her cottage, she couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. Brooks was a well-meaning man, but he was no match for the intricate web of human motives and hidden desires that lay beneath the surface of this village. She would have to proceed on her own. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Grafton, the widow who lived across the street from the Langleys. Mrs. Grafton was a kindly woman, but she had a sharp tongue and a penchant for gossip. If anyone knew something about the Langley family's past, it would be her. The moment Miss Marple stepped into Mrs. Grafton's cozy sitting room, the older woman's eyes lit up with curiosity. Well, Miss Marple," she said, settling into an armchair with a knowing smile. "I'm sure you've been up to your usual tricks, poking around trying to find out what really happened, haven't you?" Miss Marple smiled politely and took a seat opposite her. "I do enjoy a good mystery, Mrs. Grafton. But I wonder if you might be able to help me with something. You've lived in Little Skelton for many years, I believe. Have you ever heard of any disagreements between Lily Langley and anyone in the village?" Mrs. Grafton raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. "Well now, that's an interesting question. Lily has always been a quiet girl, but her aunt, Eleanor, well, she's made a few enemies over the years. Some of the old-timers say she's got a temper, though I've never seen it myself." "Eleanor Langley has a temper?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but probing. "Oh yes, but only with certain people," Mrs. Grafton replied, her eyes narrowing. "You see, Eleanor's been running the household for years, and Lily's always been under her thumb. There were whispers a while back about a possible inheritance dispute, but nothing was ever proven." Miss Marple's mind raced as she processed the information. If there was an inheritance at stake, it would explain much. Perhaps Lily had been hiding more than just a fainting spell, perhaps there was something more personal involved. "Do you happen to know if Lily has any connections with anyone outside the village?" Miss Marple pressed. Mrs. Grafton thought for a moment, then shook her head. "Not that I know of. But I wouldn't be surprised if someone had come to her aid. She's been looking a little more anxious lately." Anxiety, Miss Marple thought, was a sign of something more, a feeling of being trapped or cornered. Whatever was going on with Lily, it wasn't just a medical issue. Someone was involved, someone who had played a role in the drama that was unfolding. "Well, thank you, Mrs. Grafton," Miss Marple said, rising from her chair. "I'll be sure to keep that in mind." As she left the widow's house and walked back to her own cottage, Miss Marple felt a growing sense of certainty. She was closing in on something, but there were still too many questions left unanswered. And with every answer she uncovered, more mysteries seemed to emerge. But she was undeterred. The truth was out there, and she would find it, just as she always did. Chapter 4, A Hidden Clue. Miss Marple awoke early the next morning, the quiet ticking of her old grandfather clock in the corner of the room accompanying her thoughts. The morning light filtered gently through the lace curtains of her cozy cottage, casting delicate patterns on the walls. It was a peaceful start to what promised to be another busy day. Little Skelton may have appeared idyllic on the surface, but beneath its calm exterior, a storm of hidden motives and buried secrets was steadily brewing. The investigation into Lily Langley's collapse had become more convoluted with each passing day. Miss Marple's conversations with the villagers had revealed little, some murmurs about an inheritance dispute, hints of old tensions between Eleanor Langley and other villagers, but nothing concrete. She had visited Lily the day before. But the young woman remained evasive, her pale face hiding more than just exhaustion. There was fear behind her eyes, a fear Miss Marple had learned to recognize in the most reluctant of witnesses. Still, Miss Marple knew that she couldn't let herself be distracted by the villagers' gossip. The puzzle pieces were scattered, but she was starting to see the outlines of a bigger picture. The matchbox, the cryptic note, the tense atmosphere at the garden party, these were not coincidences. Someone in the village was hiding something, and it was Miss Marple's job to uncover it. The day began with a visit to the Langley estate. Miss Marple had made up her mind to speak to Eleanor Langley once more, to dig deeper into the seemingly calm and composed widow's past. She had seen the cracks in Eleanor's carefully maintained facade, and now she was certain there was something more to the story. The moment Miss Marple arrived at the Langley estate, the sprawling house stood in its usual, stately grandeur, but Miss Marple could sense the tension in the air. The estate, with its manicured gardens and grand facade, felt colder than usual, as if the weight of hidden secrets lingered beneath its elegant surface. As Miss Marple approached the front door, Mrs. Timmins, the housekeeper, greeted her with a polite but cautious smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple. How may I assist you today?" "I was hoping to speak with Mrs. Langley," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but firm. "Is she available?" "Of course, Miss Marple. I'll let her know you've arrived," Mrs. Timmins said, stepping aside to allow Miss Marple into the hallway. The house was quiet, the stillness in the air punctuated only by the faint echo of footsteps in the distance. Miss Marple couldn't help but notice the polished furniture, the pristine floors, all signs of the meticulous care with which Eleanor maintained her home. But there was an underlying tension in the room, a sense of unease that couldn't be ignored. Mrs. Timmins soon returned and led Miss Marple to the drawing room, where Eleanor Langley was seated by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The widow looked up as Miss Marple entered, offering a faint smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Eleanor said in her smooth, controlled voice. "It's good to see you again." "I'm afraid I must impose upon you once more," Miss Marple said, taking a seat across from Eleanor. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and there are a few more questions I'd like to ask." Eleanor's expression remained composed, though Miss Marple could see a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady. "I'll answer whatever I can." Miss Marple studied her carefully. There was something in Eleanor's demeanor that spoke of careful control, of a woman used to hiding her true feelings. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most composed individuals often had the most to conceal. "Tell me, Mrs. Langley," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle but probing, "do you know if Lily has had any recent contact with anyone outside the family? Any visitors, perhaps, or someone who might have been keeping an eye on her?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle shift in her expression that Miss Marple noted. "No," she said firmly, almost too firmly. "Lily has been keeping to herself recently, as far as I know. She's been preoccupied with her own affairs." "Her affairs?" Miss Marple repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What kind of affairs, if I may ask?" Eleanor hesitated for a moment, her fingers tightening around the edge of her chair. Well, I suppose she's been concerned about her future," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "She's always been a bit anxious. Always worrying about something." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "Anxious about what, exactly? Is there something she's been keeping from you?" Eleanor's composure began to crack. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze momentarily drifting toward the window. "Lily's always been a difficult child," she said, her voice colder now. "She's had her share of troubles, and I've done my best to help her. But sometimes, people can't help themselves. You can offer them everything, but they still find a way to go their own way." Miss Marple didn't press her further, though she noted Eleanor's words carefully. There was a coldness in her voice, a note of resentment perhaps. Lily's troubles seemed more significant than Eleanor was willing to admit, and Miss Marple was sure the widow's carefully controlled exterior was hiding more than she was letting on. "Thank you for your candor, Mrs. Langley," Miss Marple said softly, her mind racing with the implications of the conversation. "I may need to speak with Lily again. I believe she is hiding something from me." Eleanor stiffened slightly at the mention of Lily, but she quickly masked her reaction. "Of course, Miss Marple. I'm sure she'll tell you whatever you need to know." As Miss Marple rose to leave, she paused at the door, turning back to Eleanor. "One last thing, Mrs. Langley. Do you know anything about a matchbox? A small wooden matchbox, perhaps?" Eleanor's face paled, and for a moment, she seemed to freeze. Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice tight. "I've never seen such a thing." Miss Marple studied her carefully, noting the subtle panic in Eleanor's eyes. The widow's denial was so swift, so automatic, that Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder if it was an attempt to conceal something more than just ignorance. "Very well," Miss Marple said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "But I suspect we'll be seeing more of that matchbox in the future." That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind buzzing with new questions. Eleanor Langley's reaction to the matchbox had been revealing. It was the first time she had shown any genuine emotion since Miss Marple had arrived, and that was a clue in itself. The widow was hiding something, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. As she sat by the window, contemplating the day's events, she noticed a familiar figure approaching from down the street. It was Dr. Weston, the village physician, a man Miss Marple had come to trust over the years. He had been the first to arrive at the scene of Lily's collapse, and while he had seemed confident in his diagnosis, Miss Marple wasn't so sure. Dr. Weston knocked lightly on her door and stepped inside when invited. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his face lined with concern. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Doctor," Miss Marple replied, gesturing for him to sit. "I trust you're well?" "I'm doing fine, thank you," Dr. Weston said, settling into the chair across from her. "But I wanted to speak with you about Lily Langley. I've been giving it some thought, and I'm not entirely convinced that what happened to her was as simple as it seems." Miss Marple's eyes lit up with interest. "Indeed? Tell me more." Dr. Weston leaned forward, lowering his voice as though speaking to someone who might be listening. "I've been thinking about the symptoms she exhibited, and I'm not so sure it was just a fainting spell. There were subtle signs. Dizziness, confusion, that don't quite match the typical causes of heatstroke or exhaustion. In my professional opinion, something else might be at play here." Miss Marple's mind raced. She had suspected all along that there was more to Lily's collapse than a simple fainting spell. Now, it seemed, Dr. Weston was confirming her suspicions. "Do you think it could have been something intentional?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady. Dr. Weston hesitated, his eyes darting to the door as though checking for eavesdroppers. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "But there's one thing I do know for certain, Lily's collapse wasn't just an accident." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. It seemed that the pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to fall into place. The matchbox, the cryptic note, the mysterious illness, it all pointed to something much darker than anyone had imagined. And Miss Marple was just getting started. Chapter 5, Confrontations and Secrets. The days in Little Skelton had become a blur of suspicion and whispered conversations. The village that once exuded charm and tranquility now felt charged with an unseen tension, the very air thick with unease. Miss Marple, ever the observer, had taken to her usual habits, watching, listening, piecing together fragments of information that might reveal the truth behind Lily Langley's sudden collapse. She had spoken to most of the key figures in the case, but each conversation only raised more questions. It was clear now that there were layers to this mystery, layers that Miss Marple was determined to peel away, one by one. Her visit to the Langley estate earlier that week had only deepened the mystery. Eleanor Langley's sudden and vehement denial of any knowledge of the matchbox had been telling. The widow's reaction to the seemingly innocuous object had been swift, and Miss Marple had seen enough in that fleeting moment to know that Eleanor was hiding something. But what? Dr. Weston, too, had raised troubling doubts. His observations about Lily's condition had thrown a shadow over what had initially seemed like a simple case of fainting. It was as though a much larger, more sinister force was at play, something that none of the villagers, least of all the local constable, had yet been able to uncover. The following morning, Miss Marple awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. She had spent the night turning over the facts in her mind, considering every angle, and one thing had become glaringly obvious: she needed to confront the key players in the mystery. Lily, Eleanor, Mrs. Timmins, and even Dr. Weston, each had a role to play, and it was time to uncover just how deep their involvement went. The Langley estate was eerily quiet as Miss Marple arrived, her footsteps muffled by the gravel path that led to the front door. It was late morning, and the household seemed to be going about its usual routine. The door opened almost immediately when she knocked, and Mrs. Timmins greeted her with a curt nod. "Good morning, Miss Marple," the housekeeper said, her voice polite but distant. "What can I do for you today?" "I'd like to speak with Mrs. Langley, if she's available," Miss Marple replied, her tone firm but not unkind. "I'll let her know," Mrs. Timmins said, stepping aside to let Miss Marple enter. The house was as pristine as ever, the heavy curtains drawn to shield the rooms from the harsh daylight. The scent of polished wood and fresh flowers hung in the air, but there was something unsettling about the atmosphere. It felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Moments later, Eleanor Langley appeared in the doorway of the drawing room, her usual poise and composure intact. Yet Miss Marple couldn't help but notice the faintest tremor in her hand as she greeted her. Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise, Eleanor said, offering a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. What can I do for you? I was hoping we could talk, Mrs. Langley, Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but insistent. There are still some matters regarding Lily's condition that I haven't quite understood. Eleanor stiffened slightly, her smile faltering. I've already told you everything I know, Miss Marple. I don't know what else I can add. Perhaps there's more than you've shared with me, Miss Marple said gently. I've been speaking with Dr. Weston, and he mentioned some irregularities in Lily's condition, signs that suggest something more than just a fainting spell. Eleanor's face paled, and for a brief moment, she looked almost vulnerable. What are you implying, Miss Marple? She asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. Miss Marple regarded her carefully. I'm not implying anything, Mrs. Langley. I'm simply trying to piece together the facts. The matchbox, for instance, the one Lily was holding when she collapsed. You seemed very agitated when I mentioned it the other day. Why was that? Eleanor's breath caught, and for a moment, she seemed to struggle with the weight of the question. Then, with a stiff nod, she replied, I've told you, I don't know anything about that matchbox. It must have been some kind of misunderstanding. Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly. But I've learned over the years that sometimes people deny things because they're afraid of the truth. Eleanor looked away, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the lace tablecloth in front of her. I have nothing more to say, she said coldly, her eyes narrowing. Lily is a grown woman. She can speak for herself if she chooses. Miss Marple's heart sank. She had expected resistance, but the icy tone in Eleanor's voice spoke volumes. It was clear now that the widow had more to hide than she was willing to admit. And Miss Marple knew that her next step would be to press Lily for the truth. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the guest room where Lily had been resting since her collapse. The young woman was lying on the bed, her eyes closed as though she were sleeping, but Miss Marple could see the subtle tension in her body, tension that suggested she wasn't resting at all. Lily? Miss Marple said softly, her voice gentle but firm. Lily opened her eyes slowly, her gaze flicking to Miss Marple's face with a mixture of surprise and wariness. Oh, Miss Marple. I didn't expect you today. I thought it was time we had another conversation, Miss Marple replied, taking a seat beside the bed. There are still things I don't understand, and I'm afraid we're running out of time. Lily's eyes shifted uneasily, and for a moment, she seemed to consider refusing to speak. But then, with a deep breath, she sat up slightly in bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. What is it you want to know, Miss Marple? Miss Marple studied her carefully, noting the faint lines of worry on Lily's face. The young woman was hiding something, of that Miss Marple was certain. But what? Tell me about the note you were holding, Miss Marple asked gently. The one you found in the matchbox. Lily flinched at the mention of the matchbox, her face paling. I don't know what you mean, she stammered, her voice trembling. I think you do, Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady and calm. Lily, it's important. I'm trying to help you, but I can't do that if you won't tell me the truth. For a long moment, Lily didn't speak. Her gaze dropped to her hands, and Miss Marple could see the struggle in her eyes, the fear, the guilt, and the deep uncertainty that had been plaguing her since the night of the garden party. I didn't want anyone to know, Lily said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I could handle it on my own, but now it's all getting out of hand. The note, it was from someone I thought I could trust. Who? Miss Marple pressed gently, leaning forward. Lily hesitated again, her eyes darting toward the door as though expecting someone to walk in. It was from Andrew, she said quietly, her voice breaking. Andrew Tate. He's been threatening me, Miss Marple. He wants something from me, something I can't give him. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Andrew Tate's name. She knew the man. He was a local businessman, well known for his charm and ambition, but also for his tendency to manipulate those around him. Miss Marple had seen enough of his type in her years of observation to know that he was not someone to be trusted. What does he want from you, Lily? Miss Marple asked, her voice low. Lily's face crumpled in distress, and she seemed to struggle with the words. He wants money, she said, her voice trembling. He's been asking me for money for months, and I've been trying to keep it from my aunt. But now it's gotten worse. He said if I didn't meet him at midnight, he would hurt someone I care about. Miss Marple's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The matchbox, the cryptic note, the tension between Lily and her family, all of it pointed to Andrew Tate as the mastermind behind the plot. He was using Lily to get what he wanted, and now Miss Marple had the key to unraveling the mystery. I understand, Lily, Miss Marple said gently, placing a reassuring hand on the young woman's arm. But you must tell me everything. You can't keep hiding this from me. Lily nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I'll do whatever it takes to make it right," she whispered. Miss Marple left the room with a heavy heart, her mind already turning over the new revelations. Andrew Tate was the missing link, the shadowy figure pulling the strings behind the scenes. But Miss Marple knew that his role in this drama was far from over. She would have to confront him, and when she did, the truth would finally come to light. Chapter 6, another twist. The days that followed Lily Langley's confession were filled with quiet contemplation and a growing sense of urgency. Andrew Tate, the man whose shadow had loomed over the young woman's life, was now at the center of the mystery Miss Marple was working to solve. But though the pieces were slowly coming together, Miss Marple knew that there was more to this puzzle than a simple case of blackmail. The deeper she delved into the lives of the Langleys and their secrets, the more tangled the web became. The revelation about Andrew Tate had thrown a new light on the situation. Lily's fear was palpable, and Miss Marple had seen enough of her behavior to know that she was telling the truth. The question now was not just about Andrew's motivations, but why he had targeted Lily, and more importantly, how he had managed to conceal his involvement for so long. The morning had come crisp and clear, the sunlight filtering through the trees in soft beams. Miss Marple had not wasted any time. She had already made plans to visit Andrew Tate, and though she knew she would need to tread carefully, the time had come to confront him. He had been a fixture in the village for some time, a well-dressed, well-spoken man with a reputation for being charming, even to the point of being manipulative. To most of the villagers, he was just another businessman. But to Miss Marple, he was more than just a familiar face, he was a key player in a much larger drama. Her walk to Tate's estate was slower than usual, her mind working tirelessly to connect the dots. She had not yet shared Lily's confession with Constable Brooks, though she was certain he was still floundering in his attempts to make sense of the case. The constable had been hesitant to make any further moves without concrete evidence, and while Miss Marple respected his methodical approach, she knew time was of the essence. When she reached Tate's estate, Miss Marple paused before the imposing iron gates, taking a moment to survey the grand house before her. The estate, though large and impressive, seemed somehow devoid of warmth. The front lawn was meticulously kept, the hedges trimmed to perfection, but the place felt cold. There was no sign of activity, no gardeners or servants in sight. It was the kind of house that, while beautiful, seemed more like a monument to wealth than a home. Miss Marple pressed the doorbell, and after a few moments, a tall, sharp-faced butler appeared, his expression as impassive as the house itself. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said with an air of polite indifference. "How may I assist you?" "I would like to speak with Mr. Andrew Tate, if he's available," Miss Marple replied, her voice firm but courteous. The butler regarded her for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "Mr. Tate is not receiving visitors at the moment, Miss Marple. If you would kindly leave your name and business, I will pass it on." Miss Marple knew this would be the case. Andrew Tate was not one to welcome questions, least of all from someone like her, but she was undeterred. "I am afraid it is a matter of some urgency," Miss Marple said, her voice cool and authoritative. "It won't take long." The butler hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside to let her in. "Very well, Miss Marple. Please follow me." The interior of the estate was as grand as the exterior, with tall ceilings, polished wood floors, and expensive furniture. Miss Marple followed the butler down a long corridor, the walls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The house exuded wealth, but there was a coldness to it that made Miss Marple feel as though she were walking through a museum, not a home. They reached a large sitting room at the back of the house, and the butler knocked lightly on the door before entering. "Mr. Tate, Miss Marple is here to speak with you," he said, his voice almost apologetic. Andrew Tate stood at the far side of the room, his back to them as he gazed out of the large bay window. He was dressed in a finely tailored suit, his dark hair neatly combed, and his posture exuded a casual confidence that made him seem larger than life. When he turned to face her, Miss Marple saw the practiced charm that he wore like a second skin. "Ah, Miss Marple," Andrew said smoothly, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I'm afraid this is not a social visit, Mr. Tate," Miss Marple said, her voice measured. "I'm here to discuss something more serious." Andrew raised an eyebrow, though his smile never faltered. "I see," he said, stepping forward and gesturing for Miss Marple to sit. "Please, have a seat. Let's see if we can make this as pleasant as possible." Miss Marple remained standing, her gaze fixed on him. She wasn't interested in pleasantries. "I understand you've been in contact with Lily Langley," she said, her voice steady. Andrew's expression remained unchanged, though there was a slight tightening around his eyes. "Lily Langley?" he repeated, feigning surprise. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean." "Don't play coy, Mr. Tate," Miss Marple said, her voice sharp. "I know about your relationship with Lily. I know about the threats you've been making. And I know about the note you sent her." At this, Andrew's face darkened slightly. The charm slipped, replaced by something more calculating. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Miss Marple," he said, his voice cold now. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Lily and I are merely acquaintances. Any suggestion otherwise is completely unfounded." Miss Marple took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "I don't think you're being entirely truthful, Mr. Tate. I've spoken to Lily, and I know you've been extorting her for money. I also know you've been using her fear of harm to get what you want. And that note you sent her, well, I suspect that's just the beginning of your scheme." Andrew's eyes flickered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I think you're jumping to conclusions, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth, though there was a trace of tension beneath the words. "I suggest you mind your own business. You've no idea what you're talking about." Miss Marple stood her ground, her gaze unflinching. "I know more than you think, Mr. Tate. And I will find out the rest. If you have anything to do with what happened to Lily, I will make sure the truth comes to light." Andrew's expression tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. For a brief moment, the veneer of politeness cracked, and the menace in his eyes was unmistakable. "I suggest you leave, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Now." Miss Marple didn't flinch. She had seen this kind of threat before, though never so direct. "I'm not going anywhere until I have the answers I need," she said firmly. Andrew seemed to hesitate for a moment, weighing his options, but then the cold smile returned to his face. "You're a persistent woman, Miss Marple. I'll give you that. But don't make the mistake of thinking you're in control here. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Miss Marple smiled softly, her eyes twinkling with quiet resolve. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Mr. Tate. And I will see this through to the end, no matter what it takes." As Miss Marple made her way out of the estate, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the encounter settle on her shoulders. Andrew Tate was more dangerous than she had imagined, and his threat was not one to be taken lightly. But Miss Marple had faced far worse in her years of observation and deduction. She knew that in time, the truth would come to light, no matter how deeply Tate tried to bury it. The next steps were clear now. Andrew Tate had shown his hand, but there was more to uncover, more pieces to fit into the puzzle. Miss Marple would not rest until she had all the answers. The game was afoot, and she was determined to see it through to the end. Chapter 7, the final test. The days following Miss Marple's confrontation with Andrew Tate were both tense and revelatory. Little Skelton, once a quiet and idyllic village, had become a place of shadows, secrets, and whispered fears. Miss Marple's mind was as sharp as ever, but the closer she got to the truth, the more complex the puzzle became. Andrew Tate's calm facade had cracked during their meeting, but there was still no direct proof of his involvement in Lily's plight. The trail was leading somewhere, and Miss Marple was certain that the final piece of the puzzle was just within reach. But she had to be patient, as always. The truth, Miss Marple knew, often emerged slowly, piece by piece, like a fine jigsaw. She had to wait for the right moment to strike. It was early afternoon when Miss Marple made her way to the village square, her keen eyes scanning the streets as she walked. The weather had turned, the overcast sky threatening rain, but Miss Marple felt neither the damp nor the cold. Her mind was focused entirely on the task at hand. In the past few days, she had spent more time with Lily, gathering fragments of information. Though the young woman's confession about Andrew Tate had provided a crucial lead, there was still the matter of the matchbox. Lily had claimed that she didn't know where it had come from or why she'd been holding it when she collapsed. Yet, there was something in her eyes, something that suggested the matchbox was more than just an innocuous item. There were too many inconsistencies in Lily's story, too many gaps that couldn't be filled by just Andrew Tate's threats. Miss Marple's instincts told her that Lily knew more than she was willing to admit, and Miss Marple was determined to find out what that was. The village square was lively with its usual bustle. Mrs. Hall's bakery emitted a warm, inviting scent of fresh bread, and children ran by, laughing and chasing one another. The comforting normalcy of it all was an ironic contrast to the darker undercurrents Miss Marple had uncovered. As she walked, she felt a growing urgency. Something had to give soon. Passing the tea shop, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Grafton sitting outside, sipping her tea and watching the world go by. She was a sharp-eyed woman, prone to gossip but also capable of revealing hidden truths when pressed. Miss Marple slowed her pace and stopped by the table. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Grafton," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "How are you today?" Mrs. Grafton looked up with a smile, her eyes twinkling as she set down her cup. "Miss Marple, always a pleasure." "I'm doing just fine, thank you. What brings you out today? Haven't seen you around much lately. Busy with your investigations, I assume?" "Busy indeed," Miss Marple replied with a smile. Though it seems there are always more questions than answers. Ah, that's always the way, isn't it? Mrs. Grafton said, her tone dipping slightly. Speaking of which, I heard something interesting yesterday. You know, I don't usually get involved in other people's business, but, well, I did hear some things about Lily Langley and Andrew Tate. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. Oh? What did you hear? Just bits and pieces, Mrs. Grafton said, lowering her voice. But there's talk around town that Andrew has been more than just friendly with Lily. Not in the way a gentleman would be, mind you. There's something more behind it, something not quite right. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her curiosity growing. You don't say. And what have you heard about Lily's behavior? Has she seemed anxious? Nervous, perhaps? Oh, she's always been a quiet thing, Mrs. Grafton said, her eyes narrowing in thought. But recently, yes, I've noticed she's been even more on edge than usual. She doesn't come to the shop as often, and when she does, she seems distracted, as if she's constantly looking over her shoulder. Miss Marple nodded slowly, taking in the information. I see. And have you heard anything about her relationship with her aunt, Eleanor? Mrs. Grafton hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure no one was listening. Well, Eleanor's always been a little controlling, if you ask me. I've heard from a few people that there's been tension between the two of them lately. Nothing serious, but enough to cause some friction. Miss Marple's mind was already racing. The relationship between Lily and Eleanor Langley, the sudden change in Lily's behavior, and now the threat from Andrew Tate, it was all starting to fall into place. But one piece of the puzzle was still missing, the matchbox. Thank you for your insight, Mrs. Grafton, Miss Marple said, standing up. You've been most helpful. You're welcome, Miss Marple, Mrs. Grafton said, smiling. I'm sure whatever you're working on, you'll figure it out. You always do. Miss Marple smiled politely and made her way to the Langley estate. The next step in her investigation was clear. She needed to speak with Eleanor again, this time with more urgency. There were too many threads to pull, and Miss Marple could sense that the truth was just within reach. When Miss Marple arrived at the Langley estate, she was immediately shown into the drawing room, where Eleanor Langley sat, her posture as stiff as ever. The widow looked up as Miss Marple entered, and for a moment, their eyes met. There was a fleeting moment of recognition, and Miss Marple could see the subtle wariness in Eleanor's gaze. She knew that the widow was hiding something, and it was time to get to the heart of the matter. Good afternoon, Mrs. Langley, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but insistent. I must apologize for coming unannounced, but I believe it's time we had another conversation. Eleanor's lips tightened, but she said nothing. She gestured for Miss Marple to sit, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I suppose you have more questions, she said, her voice tight. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, taking a seat. But this time, Mrs. Langley, I need you to be completely honest with me. Eleanor's expression faltered for a moment, and Miss Marple could see a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or guilt. I've told you everything I know, she said, her voice tinged with frustration. There's nothing else to say. Are you sure about that? Miss Marple asked softly. You see, Mrs. Langley, I've been speaking with a few people in the village. They've told me some things about you, about your relationship with Lily, and the tension between you two. Eleanor's eyes widened ever so slightly, but she quickly masked the emotion. I don't know what you've heard, she said, her voice icy. But whatever it is, I assure you, it's all exaggerated. Lily has always been a quiet, sensitive girl. I've done my best to protect her, but she's been increasingly difficult to manage. I see, Miss Marple said, nodding slowly. And what of the matchbox? Do you know where it came from? Eleanor's face drained of color, and Miss Marple saw the faintest tremor in her hand as she reached for her tea cup. For a moment, the widow seemed to lose herself in the motion of pouring the tea, as if trying to gather her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold and controlled, though Miss Marple could hear the slight edge of desperation beneath the words. I don't know anything about a matchbox, Eleanor said, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. I've never seen it before. Are you sure about that, Mrs. Langley? Miss Marple pressed gently. Because I have reason to believe that the matchbox is the key to everything. It's the one thing that ties everything together, the note, Lily's collapse, and your involvement in it. Eleanor's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Miss Marple could see a flash of recognition. But it was gone as quickly as it came. Eleanor took a deep breath, her shoulders stiffening. I don't know what you think you're uncovering here, Miss Marple, Eleanor said, her voice low and dangerous. But if you continue down this path, you might find that the truth is more than you can handle. Miss Marple met Eleanor's gaze evenly, her expression unwavering. I'm not afraid of the truth, Mrs. Langley. But I do believe you're hiding something, and I'm determined to find out what it is. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence in the room was thick, and Miss Marple could sense the weight of Eleanor's resistance. The widow was close to breaking, Miss Marple could feel it. The final test was near, and the truth would be revealed soon. She just had to be patient a little longer. Eleanor's eyes flicked to the door, and Miss Marple knew that their conversation was coming to a close. With a quiet nod, Miss Marple stood up and turned to leave. "We'll speak again soon, Mrs. Langley," she said softly. "And when we do, I expect you to have more answers for me." As Miss Marple walked out of the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just taken one step closer to uncovering the entire truth. Chapter 8, the final reveal. The morning sun in Little Skelton was pale and hesitant, casting a gentle light over the village that seemed, for a fleeting moment, untouched by the tensions of the past weeks. But Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the manicured lawns and flowered hedges lay currents of deceit and fear, quietly rippling through every household. Today, however, would bring those currents to the surface, like leaves stirred by an unseen hand. Miss Marple had spent the previous night reflecting on every conversation, every glance, every nervous tick she had observed. She had reviewed the events surrounding the Matchbox. "I have been observing carefully, and the smallest details often tell the largest truths. For instance, the Matchbox, discovered in a very peculiar manner, seems innocent enough. And yet, it was anything but. It was a signal, a key to understanding the recent sequence of events. Would you care to explain, Miss Langley?" Eleanor stiffened. "A signal? I don't understand." "You see," Miss Marple continued, "the Matchbox was never intended for general use. It was carefully placed to direct Miss Langley's niece, Lily, in a certain way. It indicated times and actions, influencing her behavior and decisions. A subtle method, perhaps, but one that left a very clear trail." Andrew's expression flickered. "That's ridiculous," he said sharply. "It's just a box, an ordinary box." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ordinary boxes rarely have such consequences." Andrew Tate's insistent visits, Eleanor Langley's strained civility, and, above all, Lily's fragile fear. There had been no need for forensic evidence here. The truth lived in human behavior, in subtle gestures, in the inconsistencies between words and actions. And now, it was time for the final test. She arrived at the Langley estate just as the clock chimed 10, a modest hour by village standards, but sufficiently early to unsettle her suspects. Eleanor Langley greeted her with the same poised smile, though there was an edge of unease to her movements. Andrew Tate was already there, pacing in the drawing room, his hands clasped behind his back, an anxious tension betraying the calmness he tried to project. Lily stood by the window, pale, but with a newfound resolve reflected in her eyes. Miss Marple's entrance was unassuming, yet it carried authority. She chose a seat opposite the two main suspects, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice like a gentle stream, carrying undercurrents of steel. "I think it is time we had a little conversation." Andrew shifted, attempting a polite smile, but it faltered. Eleanor, meanwhile, maintained her composure, though her eyes flicked toward Lily with something Miss Marple recognized immediately, fear disguised as concern. "I trust you both slept well," Miss Marple continued, her tone measured. "I'm afraid sleep may have been difficult, knowing that secrets have a way of surfacing." Eleanor's lips pressed tightly together. Andrew's jaw clenched. Miss Marple allowed herself a slight smile. She had seen this before, the instinctive tightening of features in the guilty, the almost imperceptible adjustments of posture when caught in a web of lies. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said finally, her voice steady but thin, "I fail to see why all of this has come to such a fuss. Surely you are overthinking matters." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied calmly. "And yet, it is extraordinary what ordinary things can reveal. The Matchbox was observed, handled, and even feared. That fear points to knowledge beyond the surface, knowledge that someone sought to exploit. Lily, would you care to elaborate?" Lily, her hands clasped tightly, stepped forward. "It was, both of them, they made me fear it. I didn't know what to do, I only knew that when I saw it, Andrew would come, and my aunt, she expected me to obey. They were forcing me to sign papers for the estate, to hand over everything." A tense silence filled the room. Eleanor's face paled. Andrew's jaw dropped slightly. Miss Marple allowed the pause to linger. She could see it in their reactions, the tightness in Eleanor's shoulders, the nervous tapping of Andrew's fingers. And in that moment, the psychological trap she had prepared began to take effect. "You see," Miss Marple said softly, leaning forward, "it's not merely the presence of a threat that convinces someone, but the careful orchestration of fear. Both of you have relied on Lily's compliance through intimidation, and yet, small mistakes reveal your true roles. Eleanor, your feigned concern never masked the impatience you showed when events did not follow your desired pattern. Andrew, your eagerness to control the situation betrayed your complicity. Eleanor's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth, perhaps to deny, but no words came. Andrew's face turned a shade redder, the facade of calm disappearing like morning mist. Miss Marple continued, her voice a soft thread pulling the truth from their defenses. And yet, she said, there is always one more sign, a single gesture, or a fleeting expression that confirms what the mind attempts to deny. Eleanor, when Lily first mentioned the matchbox, you asked an unusually detailed question about its appearance and placement. It was subtle, but to someone who observes human nature closely, it spoke volumes. Eleanor's composure finally cracked. She sank into her chair, her hands trembling. I only wanted to protect the family fortune. I never meant. Her voice faltered entirely. Andrew slumped in his chair, realizing that his schemes were laid bare. We didn't mean to force her, it was supposed to be subtle. She wouldn't notice. Miss Marple nodded gently, the puzzle complete in her mind. Subtlety can never shield deceit entirely. Fear and manipulation leave marks, and human behavior always tells the story, even when words do not. Lily stepped closer, her voice firm for the first time. You lied to me, both of you. You used me to take what was not yours, and you thought no one would notice. Miss Marple reached for the matchbox, holding it carefully between her fingers. This simple object, she said, has revealed everything. It was not merely a signal, it was a symbol of coercion, and now, its purpose has been undone. There are no more shadows under which deception can hide. Andrew looked at her, despair mingling with anger. What now? What happens to us? Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, yet unyielding. Justice will take its course. The police have been informed, and the evidence, bolstered now by your own confessions, will ensure that truth is served. But more importantly, the fear and manipulation that plagued this house are over. Lily can reclaim her life, free from coercion. Eleanor's face crumpled, the carefully constructed mask of propriety gone. I never wanted. Her voice broke, and tears rolled down her cheeks. The facade of authority and control had evaporated entirely, leaving only a human being confronted by her own wrongdoing. Miss Marple rose, her movements serene and deliberate. And now, she said softly, you can reflect on your choices. Perhaps, in time, you will understand the consequences of attempting to bend another's will through fear. Human nature is delicate, and those who exploit it often find themselves ensnared by it. The Langley estate seemed to exhale, a quiet calm settling over the room. Lily, pale but resolute, stepped forward and took a deep breath. Thank you, Miss Marple, for helping me see through the lies, and for giving me courage. Miss Marple smiled, a serene expression that belied the sharpness of her insight. Courage, my dear, is always within you. Sometimes, it only needs a gentle nudge to reveal itself. Outside, the village carried on with its day, oblivious to the storm that had been quelled within the Langley walls. The sun now shone more confidently, glinting off rooftops and garden paths, as if reassuring the world that order had been restored. And yet, as always, Miss Marple knew that human nature was complex and fickle. Even in the calmest of villages, the undercurrents of secrecy, jealousy, and desire would continue to swirl. Her task was never finished, she only ensured that the present threat was resolved. Miss Marple stepped out into the fresh air, her mind quiet but alert. She paused for a moment on the path leading away from the Langley estate, glancing back at the grand house. Inside, Eleanor and Andrew would face the consequences of their actions, and Lily would begin anew. It was not a perfect world, she knew, but sometimes justice, subtle, human, and unwavering, was enough. And with that, Miss Marple walked back toward her cottage, the gentle rhythm of her steps echoing the quiet triumph of insight over deception. The matchbox had spoken, and its tale of fear and manipulation had finally reached its end. Little Skelton would sleep a little more peacefully tonight, though the echoes of human nature, ever intricate, ever unpredictable, would continue to weave there. The end. Thanks for watching.